welcome to a very special episode of the Royal Record here on GB News. I'm Cameron Walker, GB News' Royal Correspondent.
And I'm Svar Nanan-Sen, Royal Editor of gbnews.com.
And we have an incredibly special guest joining us on the podcast today, the goddaughter of King Charles III, India Hicks, and she'll be revealing the last thing that her grandfather said to her before he was murdered by the IRA.
She also reveals what her mother truly felt about not being invited to King Charles's coronation.
So we are delighted to be joined now by India Hicks, who is the goddaughter of King Charles III, and she has written the most extraordinary, interesting book about her mother's life, Lady Pamela, my mother's extraordinary years as daughter to the Viceroy of India, lady-in-waiting to the Queen, and wife of David Hicks, who of course is the prestigious British designer. India, welcome to the Royal Record podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm always worried by that subtitle, because it's a bit like, what did my mother actually do? She was just the daughter of someone, the lady-in-waiting to someone, and the wife to someone. But actually, I think what's interesting is, having lived now for 95 years, what I've done is captured in 252 pages a lot of that life experience and looking back. And of course, my mum absolutely was the daughter of the last Viceroy and a lady-in-waiting to our late Queen Elizabeth II, and of course the wife of, as you say, my father, who was a very well-known, recognised, dynamic designer, certainly in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s. But my mother's life, even though it was very much a life of privilege, and she did have this amazing front row seat at so many historical and extraordinary events that unfolded in the last century, but also she had a life that was definitely touched by tragedy, the murder of my grandfather by the IRA in 1979. She developed breast cancer after that. She's had a number of chapters of her life that were not easy. And I think it's fascinating when I did the book, which is, of course, a beautiful illustrated biography with lots of amazing press clippings and invitations, but to actually dig a little deeper and find out what those life lessons were.
And India, you talk, of course, that your mother's lived through this extraordinary period of history, 95 years. How difficult was it to persuade her to give you access to all those archives, the beautiful pictures which are included in the book, the fascinating artifacts, to actually publish the book?
Well, good question, because it was difficult. Because, of course, she says that, you know, she comes from a generation where you don't look in, you only look out. It was not a me generation, which is what she feels we have all somewhat become. So for me to say I want to do a book about you goes exactly against her philosophy on we need to look out and not in. So I did mention in the first chapter that it was rather a persuasive assault, but I felt that it was a very unique life, and she had lived in the shadow of very great parents. My grandparents were quite extraordinary. My grandfather was working very hard as last Viceroy of England, Colonel-in-Chief of the Lifeguards, First Admiral of the Fleet. He was Chief of Combined Operations during the war. My grandmother, who had lived a very frivolous life up until the war, then really became very, very serious and dedicated herself to helping others. So my mother didn't really see her parents very much, but lived very much in the shadow of them. Then, of course, 2 Commonwealth tours with the Queen, very much in the shadow of the Queen, rightly so. And then, of course, very much in the shadow of David Hicks, who was this big whirling dervish of a character. And she had a very strong older sister who became a judge and was a very serious person. So I think I wanted to tell my mum's story, which I felt needed to come out of all the shadows of those extraordinary people she lived around.
And is she pleased with the book?
She doesn't want the attention, which is why I'm doing all the interviews and she is not. But I think seeing your life compiled into beautiful imagery is something that is she was actually, I think she was all right with that. She did ask for 2 things. She said, would I start the book with the year 1929? And I think she's right, because not many people probably have a book that's just been launched and published that begins with 1929. And she asked that I include the photograph of her winning the ladies' race in Malta. And it is an amazing photograph. And it's not just that it's an amazing photograph. It's just, to me, it's amazing because she's winning the race wearing very elegant sunglasses and a pith helmet. And that's probably totally illegal nowadays. I wouldn't get away with that. I'm going to try. Here we are. And there is the image of her on that horse winning that race.
Oh,
And
it's
it is
beautiful.
fashion at that time.
Yeah, and I suppose you mentioned Malta, and she spent many a happy day, perhaps, with the late Queen when she was Princess Elizabeth and she was living in Malta. So your mother must have got a fascinating insight into the private life, but also the private personality, perhaps, of the late Queen.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think obviously doing those Commonwealth tours where you're months, literally months at sea and going from country to country to country. I mean, they covered more miles than any other Commonwealth tour. So of course you get to know someone very intimately. Also, she had grown up as a cousin of the Queen, even before the Queen was destined, or not destined, rather thrown into the role of a sovereign. So, one of my mum's early diaries, it said tea at Buckingham Palace in big childish writing. So she had seen, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret throughout her childhood, lots of memories of playing horses. Princess Elizabeth was always the rider. Princess Margaret was always the horse. My mother, also as a younger sister, was always the horse, and her sister was always the rider. And I think, she was close. And then, of course, comes that extraordinary moment when they're in Kenya on the Commonwealth tour and the King dies in England. Of course, the royal party was really the last in England to learn the news, or rather the last in Africa to learn the news, because they weren't in England. And it was very hard to get hold of them because they were in that remote part of Kenya looking out at wild animals. And my mother recalls going up that ladder with Princess Elizabeth and coming down with a queen. That's quite an amazing moment.
And what does your mother remember of the Queen's accession to the throne and her own coronation?
Lots of funny stories, actually. Very, very different, obviously, to the coronation we've just seen with King Charles, which was much more modern, and rightly so. It had a very different vibe to it. But of course, when the Queen ascended in 1952, it was a very different time. And my mother remembers that they all went in their robes, the peer robes. My uncle, who was a peer of the realm, didn't have robes for some reason, and he worked in the film and TV business. And my aunt, being very practical, said, "Well, why don't you just borrow them, the costume department?" So my uncle actually went to coronation in these fake robes, which is rather fun. But my mother remembers that it was such a long service because they had to get, however, I think it was 3,000 or 4,000 people into their abbey, and that some of the elder ones knew that it was going to be very long and be very hungry, so they put their sandwiches inside their coronets.
Wow, incredible. I suppose your mother, of course, is the cousin, or was the cousin of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, the late Duke of Edinburgh. And you mention in the book this wonderful anecdote, which was perhaps slightly dangerous one, depending on who you ask, of riding bicycles. But the late Prince Philip liked playing bicycle polo, didn't he?
He did. He did indeed. Bicycle polo was enormous fun. And I think that they did do that quite a lot. I think they also played croquet when they were on deck on the QE2 going around all those different countries, which is kind of difficult when you're on a yacht that is traveling at sea. But they had fun. My mother says obviously Prince Philip was great fun. She was always slightly intimidated. He was 5 years older, and he was a slightly intimidating cousin. But she does say that, of course, when they did marry, and they were inside and the service was going on, they could hear the crowds outside singing "Every Girl Loves a Sailor." And she said the whole of England, every young girl had fallen in love with Prince Philip because he was pretty dashing.
Well, this is the wedding of the then Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip, and Lady Pamela was a bridesmaid at that wedding.
That's right, absolutely. And in fact, of course, she'd been out in India. My grandparents had been asked to go out and oversee the transfer of power, a very difficult job, a poisoned chalice, as it later became known as. Of course, Churchill asked my grandfather to go and do it. My grandfather, living a life of duty and service, felt that he could not refuse this. But it was a very critical time in the transition of power when the Queen was getting married, so they weren't sure if they were going to make it. And in fact, they did. At the encouragement of the Indian government, they said go because it will help calm things down. People won't think that this is so. It's such a fire out here. So they went back And my mother didn't have many wedding bridesmaid dress fittings. But all the other bridesmaids had time. But of course, Norman Hartland was so professional, so perfect that in fact she just slipped into that dress. But there were lots of moments during all of that period as well, where the bouquet got lost, the pearls got broken. She said throughout it all, the Queen was unbelievably calm.
And nearly 30 years later, you were then a bridesmaid at Prince Charles and Princess Diana's wedding. Did you ask your mother for any advice ahead of that event, and how were your experiences different?
It's interesting. I mean, it seems so fickle. I spend a lot of time working for a disaster relief agency out in Ukraine, and I'm on the front line with bombs going off, and we're raising a lot of awareness and money. So it seems so ridiculous to be sitting here talking about being royal bridesmaid. But I do look back and realize what an enormous privilege it was, and also that it was a part of history. So I understand people are fascinated by it. I think possibly my mother and I are the only two mother and daughter royal bridesmaids. And so that they were very different times. Of course, Diana and Charles got married in that 1980s moment, very big fashion moments. Everything was big. That train was long. The dresses were big. But my mother did say to me, remember, people will have camped out overnight to get a glimpse of the royal procession. And she said, wave, you must wave. And of course, I was an 11-year-old girl. I was terribly nervous. I'd never ridden in a golden horse-drawn coach down the Mall before, but I did remember that, and I tried to wave as much as I could. And it is lovely to see the crowd so excited because, of course, it was a wedding of great happiness at that time. Nobody knew what was to come. My mother also remembers the Queen's wedding was a really wonderful moment for England because we had just come out of the difficulties of war, and it was a real celebration, a moment of great happiness for the nation.
And growing up and being part of the royal world, as you say, has moments of extreme happiness, but it also has some real tragic moments. And in the book, you speak in detail about the death of your grandfather, the murder of your grandfather, Lord Mountbatten, in Ireland. What are your memories of that day? And how do you think it affected your mother?
The reason that I wrote about it, as you say, in detail is because, of course, my mother would never have talked about it really before. But I think there's a very good lesson again to be learned from that, which is about understanding and grief. And we were, as a family, very much told this extraordinary tragedy has happened, but we will hold no bitterness. We will only look forward. We will not let this, the horror of this, invade our lives and ruin our family. And my aunt was extraordinary in setting that example. And so we have always looked forward from that time. But when I think back to those actual days, the day it happened and the days that followed, my mother was really the only adult on the ground at the time. Her father had been murdered, her sister was on a life support machine. Her sister's mother-in-law died the next day. And of course, most tragically of all, our wonderful boat lad died as well. And my cousin, Nicholas Snatchbull, along with the ducks. And so it wasn't just my grandfather who at 79 and who at it was in 1979 and he was 79, he'd spent most of his life at sea, probably could have accepted that was a way that he might have died, but he would never have accepted the murder of the others also that died with him. However, as I said, we did move forward from it. But again, it was extraordinary to see how my mother dealt and coped with that. And I think it is a lesson to us all.
And is it right that you were supposed to be on the boat with your grandfather but chose to stay behind to watch a film?
That is right, actually. And again, one always looks back at those moments and thinks, where was I at that actual moment? And I can remember it vividly. There was a lot of chaos afterwards, but I remember hearing the explosion. Interestingly, actually, I was probably saved. My life was probably saved by the fact that I have a very sweet tooth and I've been promised a trip to the sweet store and to get an ice cream. So I stayed with my brother watching Laurel and Hardy in one of the downstairs rooms when the bomb exploded. But I had been with my grandfather the day before out there with him. He loved to go shrimping, so we had been out with the shrimping nets, catching shrimps the day before.
Can you remember what your grandfather last said to you?
I do, and rather lovely. He said, "Look after my dog for me." And when 3 days later, the Queen very generously sent a helicopter to take my sister, brother, and I out of it, leaving my mother there to cope with the aftermath of it. We took off with this helicopter, and I remember I had my grandfather's dog, and of course I'd taken the word so seriously and this order that I was to look after his dog that I took the headphones off my own ears and I put them over the head of the Labrador. I was a 11-year-old girl, deeply confused. I'd never heard the words political assassination before, but I did know that I needed to look after my grandfather's dog.
Of course. And your mother and the late Queen, as you say, chartered a RAF plane for the family. They had a great relationship, your mother and the late Queen, and you and Lady Pamela attended her funeral back in 2022. But of course, can you remember hearing the news of the sad death, the sad passing of Queen Elizabeth II?
Yes, and I actually happened to be getting on a flight, and I remember before the public news we had heard a mumbling that actually the Queen might have suffered a stroke, and I called my mum that the night before, and I said before it was announced, and I said it looks unlikely that she might survive this. Would you like me to come home and be with you? And she said, it's the poor Queen who suffered the stroke. You must carry on. Again, as always, my mum very much thinking of everybody else. But of course, then I had the very, very great privilege of accompanying my mother to that funeral, to both funerals, the one in London and the one at Windsor. And it was particularly moving for me. I think, obviously, the extraordinary occasion, the beauty of it, the emotion of it, seeing our nation grieving for this extraordinary woman who has been our anchor for so many years. But for me to see my mum really seeing a chapter close was very emotional. And I remember at Windsor, which felt much more intimate. We were right in the front, and as that coffin passed us by, my mother held onto my arm because she finds those old 95-year-old hips were struggling. She held onto my arm, but she went down into the deepest of curtsies. And she stayed down with her head bowed until that coffin had walked all the way past us, or been walked past us. And only then did she come up. And I thought, that is a chapter closing.
Gosh, an end of an era.
And you and your mother, you attended so many royal events, but one that she wasn't invited to was King Charles's coronation. How did she feel about that?
She thought it was a most sensible, a really sensible route that they were going, which was, instead of filling those seats with old family relatives, that you fill them with people who have done extraordinary things for our country and who needed to be thanked and recognised, and much more current. And I think that was, for my mother, a sign that this was going to be a new sovereignty. This was going to be a much more modern way of having a royal family in place. And I think it sent the best possible message that things were going to be done differently, and that this was going to be a more inclusive royal family.
And your mother spent many, many months with the late Queen on Commonwealth tours, and King Charles will be going on his own Commonwealth tour in just a few weeks' time to Australia and Samoa. Do you think your mother would have any advice for King Charles, your godfather?
I think our king is very versed in all of these things. He's waited a long time for this job. He's very practiced at it. He had a lot of apprenticeship years. There's very little advice my mum could give him. I also think when the Queen undertook those two Commonwealth tours, she was incredibly young. You know, she was something like 22 when they left. And the King, of course, is of a different age. The only thing one can think of is how utterly exhausting those tours are. You are on show all the time. Your every move is judged and analysed. Your every smile, your every expression, the every word that comes out of your mouth. and everybody takes it and looks at it and manipulates it. Imagine how exhausting that must be, particularly for a man who's working very hard. So I think it will be exhausting, but I think probably very necessary.
Well, we wish him well. India Hicks, thank you so much for joining us on the Royal Record. Lady Pamela, your book on your mother is out now.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for another episode of the Royal Record here on GB News. Remember, you can get in touch with us using the email address royal@gbnews.uk or the hashtag GBN Royal Record.
And don't forget, you can keep up to date with all the latest royal news and analysis by going to gbnews.com/royal or by signing up to the Royal newsletter.
Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.